In this lesson, we're going to look at FMOD's VCA feature. We'll start by learning about what they are and the purpose that they serve, and we'll then move back over to our 3D game kit and look at where and how we might implement VCAs into our game. All of which is pretty straightforward, so let's jump straight into things and find out what a VCA is. So a VCA is a mixing tool FMOD provides us with to be used alongside events, group or return buses when we're in the mixer window. By creating a VCA and then assigning a bus or multiple buses to it, we're able to control the bus's volume, specifically in our game during runtime. Now in the past, we've set the volume of our buses during runtime by accessing the buses themselves. So why might we use VCAs instead? Well, for two reasons. The first is that VCAs, unlike buses, don't belong within our signal path hierarchy. They function from outside of it. This means that we can assign multiple events, group or return buses to a single VCA, and then adjust each of their levels by the same amount at the same time, regardless of which other buses they may be a child or a parent of in the hierarchy. They also work as a nice way of organising how your project is mixed. Because you make level adjustments to multiple items in your hierarchy, it can be an easy option for making adjustments without having to set new levels for your bus faders that will then carry over to the game when it first starts. As they focus exclusively on making level adjustments to our audio, a popular use for them is as the controls for a game's audio settings menu. So in this lesson, we're going to look at replacing our F_bus control script, which adjusted bus levels directly, with one that adjusts VCAs controlling the level of our bus's output signal. First things first, we need to create some VCAs. To do that, we're going to make our way over to the VCA tab inside of the mixer window. From here, we can right-click anywhere and create a new VCA. Now, as these VCAs we're creating will be controlled by the options inside of our game's audio settings menu, we need one for each option, which, as you'll remember from our controlling buses lesson, there was 3. So that means we'll need to create one that controls our master volume, one that will control our music, and another that will control our sound effects. Now that we've got our VCAs, we need to assign our buses to them, and to do that, we simply need to go back to the Routing tab, right-click on a bus, and select the VCA we wish to assign the bus to. So for our music and sound effect VCA, let's right-click on their matching buses and assign them to the correct VCA. Now unfortunately, we can't assign the master bus to a VCA. So in order to create a VCA that controls the level of the final signal output, we're going to have to assign all of our final buses that sit directly under the master bus in our hierarchy to the master VCA. For us, that's both the sound effects and the music buses. So again, we're going to right-click them, go to Assign VCA, but this time pick the master VCA as well. So in addition to their own individual VCAs, we can now control both of them through the master VCA. If we then go back to the VCA tab, we can now select our VCAs and see the assigned buses. All that's left to do now is quickly save our project and build these VCAs into our banks to be used in the game. Okay, so whilst we're now ready to look at hooking these up to our game, I want to quickly give you a demonstration of what adjusting these VCAs will look like. To do this, I'm going to quickly play some music from within the editor window, jump back into the mixer, and then start adjusting some levels. So if I now start pulling the music VCA fader down, you can see that whilst the fader for our bus hasn't changed, the output of the signal passing through it has. If I then slowly pull down the master VCA fader, you could again see the signal drop even further. So adjusting two VCAs that a single bus is assigned to will change the output signal's level from that bus collectively. One more thing I want to show you is what it looks like adjusting multiple items from various places in our hierarchy using a VCA, because that is arguably the main advantage to using them. Now, whilst I'm not going to carry these changes into my copy of our game, I am going to quickly assign the in-game bus under the sound effects bus to the music VCA. I'm then going to go back into our editor window and I'm going to play the teleporter event, which is being routed into our in-game bus, and play that on top of our music. Now let's take a look at the effect that that has on our signal. So if I now start to make adjustments to the music VCA, you can see and hear that the two signals from our events and the output of the buses that they pass through that we've assigned to the music VCA are changing by an even and equal amount. Now it's time to look at bringing our VCAs over to Unity in order to be controlled by our audio settings menu. And when we last looked at the audio menu for our game, we created a script called F_bus control to interact with it. Using this same script, we're going to replace some of the lines of code within it so that instead of directly influencing the buses in our FMOD project, our menu will affect our VCAs instead. So inside our project tab, let's find our script under Assets, 3D Game Kit, Scripts, and FMOD, and then select the F_bus control script. Now that we're inside the script, let's quickly remind ourselves how we set it up. Inside our class at the top of our page, we have a few different variables that have been declared. We created a bus variable to store a reference to the bus we wanted to control, a slider variable so that we could get and set the value of the slider objects that our player would interact with, a playback state variable which we use to check to see if the variable instance stored inside of the level test variable was playing or not before we played it, as well as a few basic data type variables to be used throughout the script. Now inside the start function, we set a reference to our bus variable to be used later on. We did this with the public bus path string variable, which allowed us to hook up our three main buses to each of the slider objects using this script at once. Next, we took the level our bus fader was at before our scene began and stored the value inside of the bus volume float variable. We then assigned the slider component attached to the same game object as our script and set the value of it to match our bus fader ready to start the game with. We finally created an instance of the level test event, but to only be used when the instance of this script and this class is attached to the sound effects slider. Scrolling down, we can see the public function we created called volume level. This would be called by the slider component whenever a change to our sliders had been made by our player. Once called, it would take the new value that the slider had been set to and set the level of one of our buses to match the new value. And if it again was the sound effects slider, we would play our event instance so that the listener could tell by how much they had adjusted the sound effects level by. Finally, inside our onDestroy function, we release the instance of our event. So now that we're all caught up with how our script works, let's look at replacing the bus variable with a new one that references our VCAs instead. First, we need to declare it. So inside of our class, let's declare a private variable of the VCA type. Now, the VCA type requires the FMOD and the studio namespaces, but if you're already using them at the top of your script, like I am here, then you don't have to add them to your variable. So I'm just going to write VCA. Then all you need to do is give it a name. I'm just going to call mine VCA for short in lowercase letters. Now, just like how we have a couple of value data type variables to be used alongside the bus variable, we're going to declare a couple more for our VCA. So underneath, we're going to create a public string and we're going to call it VCA path. And underneath that, we're going to create a private float and call it VCA volume. And that's all of the variables we're going to need, so let's take a look at inserting them into our script. Starting with the start function, we're going to need to get our VCAs that are in FMOD in the same way we got our buses originally. So at the top of our start function, we're going to set the VCA variable to the runtime manager's get VCA function, which looks like this. So VCA is equal to runtime manager dot get VCA. Inside this function, we're going to feed it the path to all three of our VCAs in the same way that we fed our bus variable with our multiple bus paths. We'll start by writing the first half of the path that applies to all of our VCAs, which is in quotation marks VCA : /. Then next to that, we're going to add the name of the VCA that we want to access to the end of this string, depending on which game object the script is attached to. Now later on, we'll be storing the name of all three VCAs within each instance of the VCA path variable that will be created alongside each instance of this script for each slider object. So inside of our brackets, let's add the name of that variable, which is VCA path. Now before we move on, notice how we're retrieving our VCA in the exact same way that we retrieved our buses. This is because, like with our FMOD buses, we're not creating new copies or separate instances of our VCAs. Instead, we're accessing them directly from FMOD. So let's say in your script that you created multiple variables of the VCA type, and you then assign all of those variables to the same VCA in FMOD. Well, all of those variables would have access to the same VCA. They wouldn't have their own copy of that VCA for them to use like you would expect with an event instance. Okay, so the next thing on our to-do list is to extract the level that each VCA fader is starting at and store that value inside the VCA volume variable. Now to do that, we're going to use the getVolume function, and then we're going to output the result into our VCA volume variable. Now, getting the level of a VCA fader and then storing it inside of a variable works in the same way it does with our buses. Whatever level our faders are set to when we build our banks will be represented by the value of 1, which is the value we've just stored inside of the VCA volume variable. If the fader was at -infinity, that would be represented by a 0, and anything in between will be set a value that correlates with these two max and minimum values, that being 1 and 0. So for example, if during runtime of the game we told our fader to move about halfway between the position it started at and -infinity, we'd set the value to about 0.5. Now in our case, all of our VCAs will be starting at 0 decibels, meaning that the value of 1 inside of our variable will equal our fader at 0 decibels. Okay, now that we've got the level of our faders represented by a value and stored inside of the VCA volume variable, we now want to set the sliders that our scripts will be interacting with to match that value. We first need to get the instance of that slider component that each instance of this script will be setting a value to. Thankfully, we've already done this once before, so what we're going to do is just copy, or rather cut, these two lines of code that do that, and we're just going to paste it underneath our new lines that represent our VCAs, just to keep things nice and organized. Lastly, we need to set the slider's value. Now currently it's going to match whatever value bus volume is at, but we're going to change that so that it matches whatever value VCA volume is at. Of course, we know that when the game first starts, our VCA volume variable will be starting at a value of 1, so that means that our slider component's value will be starting at 1 also. So we've now set our sliders to match our VCAs at the start of each scene, but now we need to tell our sliders to actually change our VCA's level whenever the player changes the slider's value. Now thankfully, because we set the exact same system up with our buses, we only need to make one real change to achieve this. So let's move over to our volume level function, and inside it we're going to remove the set volume function being used on the bus variable, and we're going to replace it with the same function, but this time we're going to use it on the VCA variable. And just like with the bus variable, the value that we're going to be setting our VCA to is going to be whatever new value our player has set the sliders to, which we know will be stored inside of the slider value float variable, declared inside the parameter brackets of this function. So all we need to do is write the name of it inside of our function. Now with that last change, we're pretty much good to go, but there's just a couple more tweaks we should make before we test this new script out. First, we need to change the variable that our if statements are using to check which slider object the instance of this script is attached to. Currently, they're using the bus path string variable, but we're going to replace that with our new VCA path variable. So let's remove bus path and write VCA path. Once you've done that for the first if statement, don't forget to do that for the if statement inside of volume level and the if statement inside of onDestroy. Now the bus path variable and the VCA path variable, they pretty much have the same role, and whilst we could have left our script as it was with the bus path variable, we're replacing it with a better named variable to better understand what's happening inside of our script. So lastly, we just need to remove the variables that are no longer being used, which are basically all of the variables to do with our buses. So that's bus, bus path, and volume path. Once you've done that, you can also remove the lines of code using those variables, because again, we'll no longer be interacting with our buses. And with that, we're all good to go after a final save of the script. Once you've done that, you can head on over to Unity. Now before we test our new script, we need to make some changes to the prefab of our game's settings menu, as well as the instances of it that have already been loaded into this scene here. Now let's start by finding the menu canvas object that represents it inside the hierarchy tab, moving over to the inspector tab and selecting the open button to open the prefab that it's based off of. Now, just like we did when we originally added the script to the audio menu, we need to find the child objects of the menu canvas object that are being used as the sliders for our audio. Now, those objects are the sound effects volume slider, music volume slider, and master volume slider. Let's start by selecting the sound effects volume slider object, and then in the inspector tab, scrolling down until we find our bus control script. Now you may remember from last time we set up this script that after we had attached it to all three sliders, we fed the name of the bus we wanted to be affected by each slider into the public bus path variable through the inspector tab, so that each instance of our script would know which slider it was attached to. Well, we need to do the exact same thing for our VCAs. Feed the name of each one to the correct slider. So, starting with the sound effects volume slider, we know that we want this slider to control the volume of our sound effects VCA, so all we need to do is write sound effects. Make sure that when doing this that you match the name you've put with the VCAs that you've written in FMOD perfectly, with all the correct capitalization and no spelling mistakes. For the sound effects slider, this will also tell it to play our level test event whenever the player changes the slider's value. Next, let's move on to our music volume slider, and here we're going to do the exact same thing, but this time we're going to write music. Finally, let's do the same thing with the master volume slider. Now, you may remember that when we did this the first time around, we actually left this variable blank for the master bus. And this was because to access the master bus inside of FMOD, its path doesn't include its name, as it's the only pre-built bus that must always exist for us to hear our audio. It also avoids confusing our script and code if we were ever to create a new bus and call it master bus 2. But seeing as we created and named our master VCA ourselves, we do need to include its name here for FMOD's API to find it. So we're going to write master. We're nearly ready to test our script inside of Unity, but first we need to tell our volume level function when it's going to change the value of our VCA's fader. Now again, if you'll remember from our original bus lesson, we did that using this, the Unity event attached to the slider component. Now your function may already be assigned to this Unity event, but in case it's not, all you need to do is drag the object that contains the script and the function you'd like to assign to it, then search for the function under the script. My function is volume level, and now whenever the value of this slider is changed, that function is going to activate. So once you've done that, make sure you do the same for the rest of your volume sliders. Then once you've done that, let's save our Unity project to lock all these changes in place. Okay, now before we test everything, we just need to make sure that the changes have carried over to this scene and that the sliders that are already loaded into it now have those changes. So inside the hierarchy tab, you're going to click the little arrow to the left of the name of our prefab. Then you're going to want to open up the menu canvases object, then open up audio canvases, BG, and select one of your sliders. Then looking in the inspector tab, you can see that not only do we have the correct VCA path, but we also have the correct function assigned to our slider. If the changes haven't carried over, simply make them again here. If they have carried over for each slider, then you're pretty much ready to go. Okay, here we are back inside of our game. So let's press escape to open up the menu and make our way to the audio settings menu. And now we can test our sliders. So starting with the sound effects slider, we can hear both our level test event and its level actually changing with our slider. Let's also check the level of our music and see if that will change too. And there we go. And let's also see that both the sound effects and the music will change when we adjust the master slider. And as expected, it works perfectly. And with that, we've successfully implemented our VCAs into our project. So we started out by learning what a VCA actually is and the role it kind of plays within FMOD Mixer. We then looked at how we can assign various buses to our VCAs, as well as how we can then control the level of our buses using them. Finally, we now know that by using functions such as getVCA and getVolume and setVolume alongside a VCA variable, we can implement and control them in our game via C#. So VCAs are actually a pretty simple and easy tool in FMOD that tend to get a little bit forgotten. But as we've just learned, not only are they easy to implement and use, but they also provide us with a lot of extra mixing opportunities when balancing the levels of our buses, during both production of the game and during runtime too.